This time on KEI Fabrication. Alright folks, so let me explain. Alright, we're about to take our life in our hands.
Hurry up, we're gonna go right down.
Getting ready to go on another little reconnaissance mission. Nice. Hey folks, my name is Mike. This is KEI Fabrication and welcome to my shop. And this is my most recent project, and this is my shop truck, my daily driver, my race truck, my garbage truck, and my all-around performance vehicle. If you want to follow along with the channel, you can see the progress of the build on this truck and all the modifications that have been made. So this truck has already been to car shows, it's been road racing, it's been drag racing, and it's been circle track racing. We've got a bunch more new projects in the queue. We're looking forward to meeting more of you, and for those of you who've been with the channel for a while, thanks so much for watching. I appreciate your comments and the interaction and encouragement. Hopefully through this project we've gained some credibility with you folks, and let's see what's coming up next. 57 pounds. So that's 13 pounds. We'll add another 10 for bracketry and tie rod ends. So let's call that 23, so we're saving 23 pounds. Alright, so I chose to use a Pinto rack on this because it is a small unit. It's almost the same dimensionally, and the mounting is really easy. And I've made this really beefy cross member here that my mounts are going to come off of. This right here is the big beefy cross member that goes underneath the oil pan, and that is going to give me the foundation for my rack. So it's almost identical to the Miata rack except for the way it mounts, so we're going to give it a try. That's one of the major reasons why I want to eliminate the power steering. The trouble I'm having is I'm able to overcome, but I'm going to try with a manual rack. If I need to, I'll put the power steering back in, and the majority of my problems is the reservoir, the plastic reservoir, and I will eliminate that and put a remote aluminum reservoir. So I'm going to keep all the bracketry on the engine, save the power steering pump, and keep my plan B options open. Okay, so what I'm going to do here today is I'm going to try to get to a point where the rack is actually kind of sitting in position with some mounts tacked to the cross member that's right under the oil pan there. So I'm going to machine up some metal bushings that will position the rack and be tacked onto the cross member and have it rotated to the correct angle so my steering shaft goes back as an angle that is going to allow me to hook it up to the factory steering column. So that's what today's mission is going to be. I don't know how much I'll video, just because I got to make several trips back and forth to the lathe and the chop saw and the grinder and all that stuff. So, alright, let's clean up the surfaces and figure out where the center of the vehicle is, the center of the rack, and then we'll start laying out where the mounting points for the rack need to go. Alright, so one of the problems, it's not a big deal, but my stanchions that come off of my cross member are going to be into the curve, which is not a big deal. You know, I have a bandsaw, I'll just cut that curvature into them and fit them the best I can. It just makes it a little more challenging. further complicate matters, I'm going to rotate this down about 10 degrees. That does a couple of things. It gets my tie rod alignment a little better, and it also gets my angle for my steering connection in a little better position. And it makes the top of the steering rack flush with the top of my cross member, so whatever oil pan I choose, I'm not limiting that because my cross member height is the same. So, alright, let's get to making some bushings to mount this rack like so. So step one, on the bandsaw, I cut some curvature in there. I just held it up and did a Sharpie marker, traced out the curvature, and this is step one in roughing it in. So this is an 1.5 inch round bar. I need it turned down to 1 3/8 inches. Actually, it's 1 300 inches. So there'll be a nice little shoulder here left over that the rack will bottom out on, and then I'm going to have an aluminum bushing that comes in and actually tightens down. There'll be a gap between this and the aluminum bushing, and when it tightens down, it'll really trap that rack in place. So the next step is to hold it up there, see how close I am, fine tune it, and also work that 10-degree angle in. Alright folks, so I was trying to make the brackets for the rack here, and I was headed in a direction of notching a piece of bar stock with the proper angle. And it's not that it was a big deal. I was able to get it angled where I wanted and to get it centered on the tube. However, when I went to put it in the lathe and to be able to turn this down, I found that this is too big for the through bore for my lathe, and I couldn't do it. So it kind of put me in a little predicament. So I have decided to go down a little different path here, and I have machined up the mounts for the rack. They're longer than they need to be, and I've got the bushings machined to capture that into the rack. I've got 5/8 18 grade 8 bolts, and my method now is going to be slightly different. When I made this cross member, I thought I was being fancy, you know, and made the curvature, and that's complicating things now. What I'm going to do is I'm basically going to create a situation where I can put this 1/4 inch thick piece of plate on here at the angle that's required, and then I'm going to gusset this all in and weld it all up solid so it's fully supported, and then my rack mount will be able to go directly on it and position it exactly how it has to be. The beauty of doing it this way is I can actually use the rack as a fixture to hold my rack mounts at the proper spacing and get it centered in the vehicle, and then tack everything in place. This is a bolt-in cross member, so once these rack mounts are tacked to my brackets up here, I can take it over the bench and weld it a little more permanently and gusset it all up nice, make it good and strong. Bring it over, pop the cross member back in. The rack will slide onto the mounts that I made. So the next step is going to be to tack these in position at the correct angle, and then do that on both sides, make sure they match, and then I will hold the rack up and I'll see how much I have to shorten these to get them to where they belong, and then I will tack weld these in place with the rack clamped in position so it's level, my tie rod end height is correct to my steering arms, and the angle of my steering shaft will be as desired. So the universal joint will sneak up under the engine mount and around the header and put me in a good position to connect up to the steering shaft. So, all right, it's a lot of talking. Now we got to make some action, right? Alright folks, so what I've done is I've got my brackets, the pads for my brackets, tacked to the cross member. I used my digital angle finder to set everything at the same angle, and I put this bar across so they were angled correctly, and I measured the distance all along the cross member to the front of the bar to make sure that it's oriented correctly left and right. And then what you saw me just do is go in and put some heavier duty tacks on this, so when I go to put the rack in place to mock it up, these aren't going to move around. And then if I need to bump them around slightly to change my angle of the steering shaft to be more favorable and get aggressive with the brackets, the tacks will hold it instead of just tapping it and having them snap and fall off on the floor. So now I can bring the rack back in, take this bar off, and hold it up in place. My adapters for goes onto these plates into the rack is much longer than it needs to be. So now I need to work on figuring out how far I can trim off the back of those and get them ready to tack onto the tabs. Once I'm happy with the position, then I'll take the whole cross member out, take it over to the bench, fab up all of the brackets and supports to close in this box, and it'll look like it was all one piece, just with a little angled addition onto it, and it'll be all nice and strong. I made these out of 1/4 inch. The cross member is made out of 3/16, and I'm going to use 3/16 to box in the rest of it. So it'll be a super strong foundation for the steering rack. Alright, so I've held the rack up in place, and it looks like I can take like a full inch off of these adapters. So I'm going to go do that now. So I'll do the same exact on both sides. I'll measure my dimension so they're equal to each other from this shoulder. Once I take this off and face it off, then I'll match the other one to be the same. Alright, you can see that I trimmed 1 inch off of this thing, and I turned them down. I put the nice chamfer on it to get a big weld in there, and these two shoulder heights are identical, so the rack will be equally spaced off of the brackets. So I'm going to put them back into the rack and mock up the rack again and see if I need to shorten these anymore. Alright, so what I did was I sprayed some bluing dye on the metal pads that the rack mounts are going to be welded to, and then I scribed exactly where they should be, distance from the center of the vehicle to the center line of where the rack mount is going to be. And if I hold this up in a position and I align the rack mounts with the bottom of the pad, which is kind of what I had in mind, and I make sure that flush with the thing, my steering shaft is pointed in the direction that I am going to clear my engine mounting bracket. So I'm happy with that. I got plenty of space between the oil pan and the rack, even if I go with an aftermarket pan. So I'm good with that. By putting these pads on here, this simplified the process radically. So if I ever made another cross member, I would make sure that it extended out. I had no intentions of putting a rack in this when I built this. Again, I thought I was being fancy and cool by putting a radius and a piece of box tubing. It took me a lot of hours to do that, and now I'm actually squaring that corner back off. So, all right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these mounts and I'm going to tack it in position. And then what I'll be able to do is hold the rack up without struggling and use this as a fixture to locate the other one perfectly, and then tack that one in place, and my rack will actually be in the position where it needs to be, centered in the vehicle, up and down. The tie rod ends will be in line with my steering arms, and the position of the steering shaft will clear the motor mount, which is way up here. So let's do that. All right, folks, it's tacked in place. Looks great, right? Well, this is why we only tack things in. So centering up the rack and making sure that my tie rod ends were equally distant from the frame, every time I took a measurement, I was coming up with something different. Now, I have to confess, this is the first time that I've dealt with a Mustang 2 style rack, and my center distances on a Mustang 2 are 16.00 apart, and if it was a Fox body rack, it would be 15.5. So, however, that's kind of irrelevant. I'm just stating that for point of information. The difficulty is that those two bolts, even though they're 16 inches apart, the center distance between those two bolts is not the center of the rack. So I have a scribe line on the cross member, and then right above it I have what I thought was the center is on the right hand side. The actual center of the rack is the left hand side. So first of all, I made a bad assumption, and the bad assumption was that the center of the rack was between the two mounting points. Now, somebody that does Mustang 2 stuff all the time probably say, duh, you should have known that from the beginning. Like I said, this is the first time I've done a Mustang 2 style. Normally when I do street rods, if it's a front steer, I've always used the Pinto style. And if it's rear steer, I use the Dodge Omni Plymouth Horizon rack. So anyway, I didn't know enough to identify correctly the center of the true center of the rack. And however, doing the measurements before I burned everything in, I determined that something was wrong, and I kept investigating, taking more and more measurements. And I don't know if you can see, but what I did do was I actually took the boots off of the rack and made sure that I was getting the proper measurement of the full travel of the rack, and then getting a true center of the rack using a vernier caliper to accurately position the steering rack so it was in the center of its travel. Then I measured the total width of the rack, divided it by 2, and I saw that the true center of the rack is right around 5/8 of an inch where the rack needs to be installed in the vehicle, biased 5/8 of an inch to the driver's side. So the cool thing is all I need to do is break a couple of tacks, move it over to the proper location, and put it back into position. And by moving the steering shaft to the driver's side a little bit, it actually helps get my steering coupler closer to the stock Mazda steering column and steering shaft. So discovered a problem. I refused to ignore it, did my research, did my measurements, and I'm comfortable now that when I move this rack to the proper location, we're going to have the rack positioned properly so I get the same amount of travel on my steering left to right, and you know, as it should be. So all right, that's enough jabbering. I hope that what I discovered here, again, I like learning by doing. Sometimes it's a pain, but when you do learn under those circumstances, it goes to long-term memory right away, because it caused you enough pain and suffering that it lands in long-term memory. So anyway, hopefully I'm saving you folks some trouble, and the installation that I'm doing here will provide the results that everyone should expect, right? We want equal amount of steering left to right, and obviously make sure that our steering geometry is correct from left to right. So, all right, I need to get back to work to fix my error, and then we can start moving forward. Next time on KEI Fabrication. Folks, we're back in the shop. Man, this thing makes me smile every time I come in. So we're on a mission this morning. I got on Facebook Marketplace and I saw somebody advertising a Gen 1 Chevrolet engine.